Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We have Vocab Malone back with us, and we're talking about Black Hebrew Israelites. And what I want to get into this time is, what are the core doctrinal beliefs of this group? So their theology, what is it that they believe that we ought to know about?
Well, I've got a little list here.
A whole list, like a systematic theology. Okay.
Although I don't know if we could use the word systematic,
right.
But yeah, something like that. So the first thing is presupposition that then matters for later on, which is the physical lineage of all peoples has significant theological implications.
Okay.
In short, what ethnic group you're born into matters in God's sight. It has ecclesiastical implications, it has eschatological implications, and it, most important, I think, has salvific implications.
Right, so it's almost like elect and non-elect based on your physical lineage.
Yes.
Okay.
I would describe the 12 tribes chart of Israel that the One West Hebrew Israelites use as these are potentially elect peoples, and the 18 nations chart as the non-elect peoples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we should mention too that if that term, the chart, is not familiar to viewers, they can watch the previous episode. So what else?
Secondly, most descendants whose ancestors were subject to the unjust horrors of the transatlantic slave trade are the true Israelites. I saw a meme one time that said, if you came over here on a slave ship, you're an Israelite. That's sort of the simple way to say it.
Right.
But since we're talking about One West Hebrew Israelism, the 12 tribes chart also includes Native Americans, and it also includes Hispanics. Interestingly enough, you have this religion, and they make a big deal out, Christianity is a Roman white pagan thing. This is truly for our people. Mm-hmm. But here's what's interesting, Mike. When you look at the chart, you have Judah. Judah is the so-called Black Americans. The Benjamites are like Jamaicans and folks in that region. Mm-hmm. And pretty much the rest of the chart, for the most part, is composed of basically peoples not of African descent, meaning on the 12 tribes chart, black folks are actually a minority on the chart that they've created. You know what I mean? Because
really
the other groups are Zebulon, and you've got Cuba and Simeon, right, and so Issachar, Mexican.
They were brought over on some kind of boat, but in reality they actually outnumber.
Yes,
wow.
But not as far as actual adherence. I sometimes will maybe, because they believe that they've got to get the right amount to equal 144,000 from
right.
each tribe. And so, for example, Gad are said to be the Native Americans, and yet Reuben are Seminoles, meaning you have one solitary Native American tribe pulled out mm-hmm. from the people, some of who are actually their ancestors, so it's kind of weird, Muskegee Creek, pulled out and left alone here as Seminoles are Reuben, and yet all the other Native Americans are Gad. Sometimes they'll say, how many Seminoles have you guys converted? How many Seminoles, if you need 12,000, how many Seminoles do you have right now? The Seminole inclusion as Reuben, I think, is on a rather weak chart, the weakest link of all.
It's really odd. Okay, so can you give us another one? Is there another point?
Yes, there certainly are. Virtually all modern day Jews, to them I'll put it in scare quotes, are religious and ethnic imposters. They're frauds. Jews are not Jews, they're actually Amalekites.
So the land of Israel is populated by imposters.
They love to say, if we're not the people of the book, who is? Those crackers over there in Israel? Right. They love to say that. They love to ask it that way.
Yeah.
And here's some of their lines of evidence. They'll say they're successful, they control everything. That doesn't look like the people of the book who are going to experience these curses for disobedience. And they'll say, how could this be the people of God? Don't you know that one of the biggest gay pride parades happens every year in Israel? This can't be the people of God.
That really strikes me as odd as well, because that almost seems like an argument for keeping the Black or African American population in this country impoverished, so that they sort of fit the template. Because if they become prosperous, then they don't fit the template anymore. Like, do they lose their elect status or something?
Well, they would say, don't you remember Israel under David and Solomon? They were successful because they were keeping the laws of the Most High. And so we don't want to stay in this condition But it's very interesting because this religion basically wanted to be a theodicy, but it turned into blaming God for the whole evils of the transatlantic slave trade. That's what ends up happening on it, because it had to happen as their punishment.
It was a judgment, yeah,
for disobedience.
Yeah.
And so now what they're saying is we're waking our people up, and a lot of the groups have nation somewhere in their, either in their literature or actually in their name. There's a group in LA called the True Nation. And so they think they're nation building when they wake people up, and that's why some of their titles are not just elder and deacon, they're general and captain.
Okay, there's something confusing me here. So if they're going to use the Torah, where let's just go with their view here, so that you've got a bunch of, black people who are actually the Hebrews, and they're enslaved in Egypt. And according to the biblical story, they are delivered. They're taken out of bondage, brought to the promised land and all that sort of stuff. So that would seem like they were awakened. So why would God punish a group of them later in the slave trade? Like, why would God do that?
You're saying, why would he punish a group of, well...
In other words, if this group, if what we think of as the Israelites or the Hebrews were black, and they're in Egypt, and God takes them out of Egypt, to Sinai and the Promised Land, just the simple biblical story. Why do we get a subsequent group of them punished in the slave trade?
Well,
I mean, it seems like if you're forgiven and delivered once, why are you? I mean,
the curses are perpetual.
Is it the exile thing? They link this to the exile.
They like to say the curses are perpetual, and so they might point to, say, Judges, where there's a cycle of oppression, and then God raises up a judge, and there's deliverance, and then there's success, and then the people fall back into sin, and then a cycle gets repeated for 400 or so years. They might say that's what happens, and they will use some of the New Testament language, well, it's prophetic language, of a stiff-necked people as well. They'll speak about that, or hardened hearts.
It may not work itself out in actual slavery, but it could be some other unfavorable situation, some perceived exile, something like that, that sort of makes the subsequent populations fit this template.
Yeah, and not only that, but when you talk about 70, or even what happened after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, they'll say the result was not just these punishments for sin and the dispersion that happened of Israel throughout the four corners, it's also forgetting who she is, not actually remembering, because that's why it needs to be an awakening happen, and to tell people who they are. So sometimes the street preaching is, hey, don't you know who you are? Your ancestors are written about in this book. You have a royal destiny, things like that.
So in some sense, this is linked to the old, lost tribes kind of thinking as well.
Yes.
The old British Israelism stuff, and except, obviously those two things are incompatible, the British Israelism and the black Hebrew Israelites.
Anglo-Israelism beat the Hebrew Israelites of the stripe we're talking about by about 100 years, about a century. And some of the arguments are literally flipped on their head or repurposed. Just one quick example. They used to say British. If you go into the Hebrew, you've got the word for covenant, and then ish, the word for man. So British is covenant man. This shows that the land of Britain is populated by covenant men. The Hebrew Israelites teach, and this is not a joke, what I'm about to tell you. This is not a fundamental belief, but this is part of their alt history. The Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages because a black aristocratic class ruled Europe. And so, as evidence for that, they point to the name of Britain, or the British peoples, as saying it's evident we were there and in charge because of the name is a leftover remnant. You have covenant man there. They use the same exact argument.
So you had like Caucasians steal that designation or something like that.
Yeah, like they steal everything.
Yeah, okay.
That would be the way they would think about it. Like and King James was one of the very last black aristocratic rulers of the Dark Ages. King James was black.
But that's not even the Dark Ages, though.
They have to stretch it to King. I know it's not.
They have to stretch it by almost 1,000 years.
I know it's not, but so they're not. The reason I'm saying it that way is to let you know they think King James is black, but also they have to do that because they use the King James version of the Bible. And they can't have a white guy being in charge of it.
Oh, that's very odd. Okay, what else? No, it is. It's really odd.
So all modern day Jews are imposters, they believe.
Right.
They believe they're Khazars by and large, but who are actually Amalekites. Yeah, long story.
Okay.
And then fourthly, I have on here, just it has a little bit to do more with praxis, just to note the nature of it, is that it's highly, it's a system of syncretism.
Okay.
It blends elements of Judaism, of New Testament Christianity, and even sometimes some other things as far as for the practice, and really even to a certain extent beliefs. And that's part of the reason why it's troubling or damaging, meaning if Hebrew Israelism only entailed, here's what I think my ancestors were, or something like that, that wouldn't be such a big deal. But it's like an anchor that weighs everything else down, and then when a person who was a professing Christian gets into it, they start off as, I'm a Hebrew, and next thing you know is the Trinity is a Roman pagan concept that I can't abide by. And they get more into, well, we got to keep the law.
It becomes a hermeneutic. It becomes a filter for everything else.
Yeah, it's a as Daniel Dennett says about evolution being a toxin or a toxic poison that affects it's acid that corrodes everything, is his language. Hebrew Israelism is like that with the person's belief structure as well. It could start off kind of innocent, I think I'm a Hebrew, and ends up denial of deity of Jesus and salvation by grace through faith alone. The next thing, though, on that, I mentioned the syncretism. The next thing we've touched on, I believe, a little bit, is the 12 tribes of Israel have been identified according to Scripture. So one Westers, go to Genesis 49, look at characteristics of the tribes, and then match those up with stereotypical traits of modern-day peoples to associate them together. I'll just give you one example. Okay. Genesis 49 speaks about Issachar. And it says, he saw the land was good and enjoyed a rest. Different translations will say it different, but the point is Issachar enjoying a rest. Okay? They say, if you go to Mexico, they take siestas after lunch. It's like a nap, a time of relaxing in the middle of the day. And they say the siesta is a partial evidence that Issachar are actually modern-day Mexicans.
Boy, I used to think that nothing could trump the ancient alien hypothesis for non sequitur logic, but you're pushing the boundary.
Yeah, so the rest referred to in Genesis 49 is evidence of siestas being in the Bible. Let me show you just one version. He saw that his resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he leaned his shoulder to bear a load and became a forced laborer. You can imagine what they do with that.
Right, sure.
Right, so they use that. Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between the saddlebags. So yeah, that's one that they use. With Benjamin, who they say they say Benjamites are like Jamaicans. Benjamin is a wolf. He tears his prey. In the morning he devours the prey. In the evening he divides the plunder. The key is Benjamin is a wolf. What do wolves do? They howl. They actually associate the howling of the wolf with reggae music, and they'll say how the Benjamites do what's called, it's a phrase they use, chanting down Babylon, which means to sing against the oppressive power. And they actually use the wolf language.
This is like, I hate to put it this way, but this is like totally detached from
the text itself, right?
Well, not only from the text, but in many cases, just reality. This is almost like, okay, flat earthers are still, like the craziest to me. Okay, so we're not in that territory. But, what I'm hearing is these are like textbook examples of non sequitur thinking.
Yeah.
The confusing striking a correlation between two things that may or may not be coherent at all, but then leaping to causation. So you confuse correlation and causation. There's word fallacies with the sounds of words going on here.
The Anglo Israelites did that a lot, and they do that too. Denmark is Dan's mark.
Right. It's really detached from anything that you would call either scientific or reasoned data.
Well, let's say I was a Hebrew Israelite right now, and I just heard you say that. Well, that's just your white supremacy education coming through, where you think you get to define things, and it's your Eurocentric understanding is all it is.
I actually wasn't taught that in school. See, I know that the human mouth can only make a certain number of sounds because we have a tongue and a palate and teeth and lips and things like that. And so linguists, okay, pick Western, Eastern, I don't care, pick a linguist on Mars, okay? They're going to know that the human person, the human mouth, can only make a certain number of sounds. Therefore, it's normal for sounds to be present in all languages. But when I say, you know, chin in Chinese, I'm not talking about this thing here. Okay, I'm using the same set of sounds, but it has no correlation to what the language is doing at all. And languages are bigger than words. They involve grammar. Okay, that has nothing to do with sounds. That's really the way, you know, word formation, and even written language, you know, there are rules for that. So again, I don't have to be, I wasn't taught linguistics in school. I mean, it's just something that you pick up when I get to graduate school. You're exposed to it, because my field was Semitic languages. And that was my first exposure to this kind of thing.
They would probably say, you know, especially more in relation to your misunderstanding of history and all that stuff.
Right. But see, I can count up to 30 or 40. So I can count the number of sounds that a human mouth can make. I don't need an education to do that. And I can reason very simply and say, okay, if we have a limited number of sounds, and you have people using their mouths and breathing and nasalization and all this all over the world, because humans have the same set of lungs.
Right.
They all have noses and mouths. I'm going to make a finite number of sounds, and so it makes really good sense that all of the languages on Earth have the same sounds. It's just how they're assembled that's different. So again, that's just common sense. That's a grasp on reality of the human mouth and the tongue and the nose and all that. All the things that we all share. Okay. So I don't need any of that. But again, that's a rabbit trail. But what I'm saying is, it just seems like I'm a little startled that nobody's thought about simple things like that. You know, that in other words, to question the presumption that goes into some of this.
Well, the goal of having an identity that you feel is noble.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Is such a worthy pursuit that when a person feels like they have found the place wherein to do that, the belief system that allows them to do that, to have an identity that's
See, that's actually much more coherent
and dignified.
You know, just because that comes from the gut, you know, the heart. I mean,
the argumentation almost is an afterthought.
Yeah,
it's almost.
Well, it would have to be, because it's ridiculous, you know. But the core issue, that makes a lot of sense. You know, Ancient Aliens, you know, that crowd does the same thing, in that they reject Judeo-Christian accounts of creation, how we got here. And they also reject the mechanistic Darwinistic worldview. So the ancient alien hypothesis is just a middle ground for them. It's a meaningful worldview.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing with flat earthers. There's a flat earther I talk to, and all the social media all begins with flat earth. You know, flat earth this, flat earth that.
Any other doctrinal points before we wrap up?
Well, since you mentioned the language, I think it's important when we talk about One West Hebrew Israelism to explain that they deny modern-day Hebrew as being valid, real Hebrew.
Okay.
They actually call it Yiddish. Now, I know Yiddish is two different things,
right.
But that's what they call it a lot of times.
Right.
And so they have something they call Lashawan Kadash, which is supposed to be like pure tongue.
Right, the holy language or something.
And it's based upon the idea that basically every letter only makes one sound. And what they've done is they take out all the vowel vocalizations and make their own speculative vocalization, supposedly based upon Paleo-Hebrew. And a lot of it just becomes the A sound. So a lot of times when you hear them speak, you're like...
Paleo-Hebrew had no vowels, but let's...
So they offer their own speculative vocalizations, which came by way of Angelic Vision.
Oh, okay. Well, the Angelic Vision trumps everything.
So, according to one account, Arya had an angel who visited him in his apartment and was speaking a language, and Arya did not understand it. He said, "What's that?" He said, "That's the language of your forefathers." Okay. And that was sort of the beginning for him to create Lashawan Kadash, which they teach primers of Lashawan Kadash. You can find the charts online, and you'll see everything is just the ah sound. So, Kwam Yasharala means rise Israel, for example.
Yeah, if you know a little bit of Hebrew, you can pick out the
So a lot of times, if I have friends, because sometimes I'll run into these names because they rename themselves, like Tazadakia and Tazariak and Yahana, Tahar. Sure. They rename themselves. You know, Gabar. I'll say, you know, what is this? And most of the time my friends who are more well-versed in Hebrew can usually pick out, but if a lot of times, sometimes people are like, I don't know where they're getting this one from. Sometimes it's a little tricky to find out exactly what they were trying to go for.
Let's go back to, this will be our last point here. I had in my notes here kind of an obvious one. What about Jesus and salvation? Just quickly, you know, what do they think there?
So they'll say, you mean the man who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ, Yahweh Shai. He came to do away with the need for blood sacrifice. This is the common view. They sometimes have somewhat different views, but a most common view, for example, you can hear IUIC advocate this view, come to do away with blood sacrifice, so we don't anymore have to slaughter animals. And sometimes they'll say made some changes to the law. For example, we don't have to stone adulterers right now. But
salvation is still law-based?
So a lot of them are more sensitive to that criticism than they used to be. So they'll say, no, we affirm grace, but it's very Mormon-ish, and it's God is gracious in that he allows you to earn your salvation, or this is the means he's provided to do it. Or you could at least say it's a salvific alchemy, blending of grace and works, which is no salvation at all.
You would say there's still a strong element of merit.
Oh yeah, Like you gotta do these commandments. You gotta do the law. You have to wear your fringes. There's a verse in the Bible that says the law is spiritual, and so sometimes they'll say you're not being spiritual right now, brother. Why not? You don't have your fringes on. The law is spiritual. You gotta wear your fringes. And so if you want to know a way to identify a Hebrew Israelite, for example, who's serious about it, not out on the street situation, they'll have sometimes fringes underneath their T-shirt. And that's one way you can know. You see the fringes. So the law is very important for salvation for them, yes.
Okay. Well, we're going to be hitting some more of this, you know, because I'm going to want to know, you know, okay, these are the things they believe, but when we meet again, we're going to want to know, well, how are these things defended, you know, using Scripture? Hopefully, well, I shouldn't say hopefully, but they have to attach this somehow, okay, to Scripture. So we'll hit that next time.
We'll get to the big one.
Yeah.
The big one.
Okay. Well, thanks for watching Fringe Pop 321 once again. Please visit our website for information about this topic, and of course every episode we do has its corresponding webpage. If you're interested in supporting what we do at Fringe Pop, go to fp321.com/S, as in the letter S, and come back and watch some more, because what you know may not be so.